Section 15 of The Crimson Circle by Edgar Wallace. Recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 36. The Circle Meets. Mr. Raphael Willings was a product of his age. Though he was still in the early 40s, he had pushed himself into cabinet rank by the sheer force of his character. To describe him as a popular minister would be to stretch the truth beyond permissible bounds. He was neither popular with his colleagues nor with the country, who, whilst recognising his remarkable powers and acclaiming him as the greatest of the parliamentary orators, nevertheless distrusted him. He had given so many proofs of his insincerity that it was remarkable that he should have attained to the position he occupied. But he had a number of followers, men who were unwavering in their faith, who could be depended upon to vote steadily at the lift of his finger, and the government majority was too small to risk the exclusion of the Willings bloc. Amongst his colleagues he had a bad name. It is not necessary to particularise the circumstances which produced his reputation, but it is a notorious fact that he escaped appearing in an unsavoury divorce case by the skin of his teeth. So unpopular was he that twice Merros Club and a fashionable night club, of which he was a member and an habitué, were raided by the police in the hope of compromising this mighty politician. The raid had been planned by the wife of one of his colleagues, and that Willings was not unaware of the fact was proved when the newspaper he owned aimed a bitter attack on the lady's unfortunate husband, an attack so worded, so framed, that the minister retired from public life. A well-built man, inclined to plumpness, slightly bald, there was no gainsaying his personal charm. He was under the impression that his introduction to Thalia Drummond had been skilfully manoeuvred by himself. He would have been horrified to know that the lady who introduced him had received instructions that morning from the Crimson Circle to bring the introduction about. The Crimson Circle had its agents in all branches of life and in all classes. There were bookkeepers, there was at least one railway director, there was a doctor and 3 chefs d'hôtel amongst the 100 who obeyed the call of the Crimson Circle. They were well paid and their duties were not onerous. Sometimes, as in this case, they had no more to do than to bring about an introduction between 2 people whom the Crimson Circle desired to meet. But in every case their instructions came to them in exactly the same form. The organisation of this great force was extraordinarily complete. In some uncanny way the chief of the Crimson Circle had smelt penury and disaster almost as soon as the recipients of these 2 evil factors were aware that they were present. One by one they had been absorbed, each ignorant of the other's identity, and profoundly ignorant of their master. He had come to them in strange places and circumstances. Each had his own function to perform, and generally the part which was played by the subordinate members of the League was ludicrously simple and unimportant. A few members of the Circle had, in a panic, made statements to the police headquarters, and from them it was learned how simple were some of the tasks which were given out by the mystery man. From fear of the tragic consequences of disloyalty, the majority of the Crimson Circle remained loyal to their unknown chief, and it was a remarkable tribute to his system of espionage that when he sent forth his summons, as he did on the day Derrick Yale lunched with the Commissioner, calling every member of the Crimson Circle to the first meeting they had ever held, giving them the most explicit instructions as to the garb they should wear and the means they should adopt to avoid disclosing themselves to their fellows, he omitted the waverers and the malcontents as though their very thoughts were written plainly before him. To Thalia Drummond that meeting will always remain the most vivid and poignant memory of her association with the Crimson Circle. The city contains many old churches, but none anterior in date to the church of St. Agnes on Powder Hill. It had escaped the ravages of the Great Fire, only to be smothered under by the busy city which had grown up about it. Enclosed by tall warehouses so that its squat steeple was absent from the skyline, it had a congregation which might be numbered on the fingers of two hands, although it supported a vicar who preached punctiliously every week to a congregation which was practically paid to attend. Once a churchyard had surrounded it, and the bones of the faithful had been laid to peace within its shadow, but the avaricious city, grudging so much waste building land, had passed acts which had removed the bones to a more salubrious situation, and had covered the place of family vaults with office buildings. Entrance to the church was up an alley which led from a side passage, and the figures which slunk along the unlighted way seemed to melt through the almost invisible doors into a gloom even thicker than the night. For in the Church of St. Agnes the Crimson Circle held the first and last meeting of his servitors. Here again his organisation was marvellous. Every member of his company had received explicit orders telling him to the very minute when he must arrive, so that no two came together. How he obtained the keys of the church, what careful manoeuvring he must have planned to bring the hour of meeting and the dispersal between the two periods when the lane would be patrolled by the city police, Thalia Drummond could only guess. She came into the alleyway punctually, went up the 2 steps to a door which opened as she approached, and was closed immediately she entered the lobby. There was no light of any kind, save for the faint light of night which filtered through a stained glass window. "Go straight ahead," whispered a voice. "You will take the end of the second pew on the right." There were other people in the church. She could just distinguish them, 2 in each pew, a silent, ghostly congregation, none speaking to the other. Presently the man who had admitted her came into the church and walked to the altar rails, and at the first words she knew that the servants of the Crimson Circle sat in the presence of their master. His voice was low and muffled and hollow. She guessed he wore the veil she had seen over his head the first night she had met him. "My friends," he said, and she heard every word, "the time has come when our society will be dispersed. You have read my offer in the public press, and you are interested to this extent that I intend distributing at least 20% of the money which the government must eventually give me amongst those who have served me. If there are any here who are nervous that we shall be interrupted, let me assure them that the police patrol does not pass for another quarter of an hour, and that it is quite impossible for the sound of my voice to reach outside the church." He raised his voice a little, and there was a hard note in it when he added, "And to those who may have treachery in their hearts and imagine that so widely announced a meeting might bring about my undoing, let me say that it is impossible that I shall be captured tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, I will not disguise from you that we are in considerable danger. Facts which may enable the police to identify me have on 2 occasions come to light. I have upon my tracks Derrick Yale, who I will not deny is a source of considerable anxiety to me, and Inspector Parr," he paused, "who is not to be despised. In this supreme moment I do not hesitate to call upon every one of you for an extraordinary effort of assistance. Tomorrow you will each receive operation orders prepared in such detail that it will be impossible for you to misunderstand any particular requirement I have made known. Remember that you are as much in danger as I," he said more softly, "and your reward shall be correspondingly great. Now you will pass out of the church one by one, at 30 seconds interval, beginning with the first two on the right, continuing with the first two on the left. Go." At intervals these dark figures glided along the aisle and vanished through the door to the left of the pulpit. The man at the chancel rails waited until the church was empty, and then he, too, passed through the door into the lobby and into the passage. He locked the outer door and slipped the key into his pocket. The church clock was booming the half hour when he called a taxi cab and was driven westward. Thalia Drummond had preceded him by a quarter of an hour, and in the taxi which carried her to the same end of the town she brought about a lightning transformation of her appearance. The old black raincoat which covered her to the throat, the heavy veiled black hat, were taken off. Beneath it she wore a cloak of delicate silk tissue, covering an evening dress which would have satisfied her apparently exigent master. She took off her hat and tidied her hair as well as she could, and when she stepped down at the flashing entrance of Merrow's Club and handed a small attaché case to the bowing attendant, she was a picture of radiant loveliness. So Jack Beardmore thought. He was supping with some friends much against his will, for he hated the night side of life, when he saw her come in, and scowled jealously at her debonair escort. "Who is he?" Jack's companion glanced across lazily. "I don't know the lady," he said, "but the man is Raphael Willings. He's a big pot in the government." Thalia Drummond had seen the young man before he had seen her, and she groaned inwardly. Half of what her host said she missed. Her mind was completely absorbed in other directions, and it was not until a familiar phrase reached her ear that she turned her interest towards the minister. "Antique swords?" she said with a start. "I'm told you have a wonderful collection, Mr. Willings." "Are you interested?" He smiled. "A little. In fact, quite a lot," she said awkwardly, and it was not like Thalia to be at a loss for a reply. "Could I ask you to come along to tea one day and see them?" said Raphael. "One doesn't often find a woman who is interested in such things. Shall we say to-morrow?" "Not to-morrow," said Thalia hastily. "Perhaps the next day." He made the appointment then and there, writing it ostentatiously on his cuff. She saw Jack leave the club without a look in her direction, and she felt absurdly miserable. She did so want to talk to him, and was praying that he would come over to their table. Mr. Willings insisted upon driving her home in his car, and she left him with a sigh of relief. He did not harmonise with her mood that night. There was a little forecourt to the flats in which she lived, and she had dismissed her admirer (he made no secret of this relationship) in the street outside. She had to walk a dozen paces to reach one of the two entrances, and even before she had sent her escort away she was aware that a man was waiting for her in the darkened court. She stood on the pavement until Willings's car had moved on, and then she came slowly toward the waiting man. He spoke for a minute in a voice that was a little above a whisper, and she responded in the same tone. The conversation was of a very short duration. Presently the man turned without sign or word of farewell, and walked quickly away, and the girl entered her flat. Though the man made no sign, he knew he was being followed. He had been waiting for 10 minutes in the dark of the forecourt, and had seen the stealthy figure in the doorway of a closed shop opposite the flats. Apparently, however, he was oblivious of the fact that somebody was walking behind him, somebody he knew would presently overtake him and look into his face. He turned into a side thoroughfare where the street lamps were few and far between, and as he did so he slackened his pace. Presently the spy overtook him, choosing for the point of passing a place within the radius of a lamp. He had bent his head to peer into the first man's face, when suddenly the quarry turned and sprang at him. The trailer was taken by surprise. Before he could shout, a grip of iron was around his throat, and he was flung half senseless to the stone pavement. And then, from nowhere in particular, appeared as by magic 3 men, who pounced upon the prostrate tracker and jerked him to his feet. He glared round, dazed and shaken, and his eyes fell upon the man he had been set to watch. "My God!" he gasped. "I know you!" The other smiled. "You will never be able to employ your information, my friend," he said. Chapter 37. I will see you if you are alive. Jack Beardmore went home savage and sick at heart. Thalia Drummond was an obsession to him, and yet he had every reason to believe the worst of her. He was a fool, a thrice condemned fool, he told himself as he paced the library, his hands thrust into his pockets, his handsome young face clouded with the gloom of despair. He felt at that moment he would like to hurt her, punish her as she unconsciously had punished him. He flung himself down into his chair and sat for an hour with his head on his hands, covering the old ground which reason had so often trodden that it had left a worn and familiar track. He got up sick and weary, and, opening a safe, took out a packet of documents and flung them on the table. It was the sealed envelope addressed to his father, and unopened, which interested him most, and he had a childish desire to open it, if only to spite Thalia. Why was she so anxious that he should not see the photograph which it contained? Was she so interested in Marl? He remembered with a scowl that she had spent the evening with that man on the night he died so mysteriously. He rose, and gathering the papers together, he carried them to his bedroom. He was so tired that he had not even the curiosity to probe into the mystery which attached to the photograph of an execution. He shivered at the thought of the grisly contents, and he dropped the package on his dressing table with a little grimace, and began leisurely to undress. He quite expected that he would pass a sleepless night. His emotion and the state of his mind seemed to call for such an end to a miserable day. But youth, if it has its anguish, has also its natural reaction. He was asleep almost as soon as his head touched the pillow. And then he began to dream of Thalia Drummond. And in his dream, Thalia was in the power of an ogre whose face was remarkably like Inspector Parr's. He dreamt of Marl, a grotesque, terrifying figure, whom he somehow associated with Inspector Parr's grandmother, that mother of whom he stood in such awe. What woke him was the reflection of a light from the dressing table mirror. The light had been extinguished when he sat up in bed, but, half asleep as he was certain that there had been a flash of some kind. It was hardly the season for lighting. "Who is there?" he asked, and put out his hand to reach for the lamp. But the lamp was not there. Somebody had moved it. Now he saw, and he was out of bed in a second. He heard a movement toward the door and ran. Somebody was in his grip, somebody who squirmed and struggled, and then he released his hold with a grasp. It was a woman. Instinct told him that it was Thalia Drummond. Slowly he put out his hand, groping for the electric switch, and the room was flooded with light. It was Thalia as white as death and trembling. Thalia who held something behind her and met his pained gaze with a tragic attempt at defiance. "Thalia," he groaned, and sat down. Thalia in his room, what had she been doing? "Why did you come?" he asked shakily. "And what are you concealing?" "Why did you bring those papers up to your room?" she asked almost fiercely. "If you had left them in your safe, oh, why didn't you leave them in your safe?" And now he saw that she held the sealed packet containing the photograph of the execution. But Thalia," he stammered, I don't understand you. Why didn't you tell me? I told you not to look at the picture. I never dreamt you would bring it here. They've been here to-night searching for it." She was breathless, on the verge of tears that were not all anger. "Been here to-night?" he said slowly. "Who have been here?" "The Crimson Circle. They knew you had that photograph, and they came and burgled your library. I was in the house when they came, and prayed." She wrung her hands, and he saw the look of anguish on her face. "I prayed that they would find it. And now they will think you've seen the picture. Oh, why did you do it?" He reached for his dressing gown, realizing that his attire was somewhat scanty, and in the warm folds he felt a little more assurance. "You are still talking Greek to me," he said. "The thing I understand perfectly is that my house has been burgled. Will you come with me?" She followed him down the stairs and into his library. She had spoken the truth. The door of the safe hung drunkenly upon its hinges. A hole had been cut through the shutter, and it was open. The contents of the safe lay upon the floor. The drawers of his desk had been forced open, and apparently a search had been made amongst the papers on the desk. Even the waste paper basket had been turned out and searched. "I can't understand it," he muttered. He was pulling the heavy curtains across the window. "You will understand better, though I hope you do not understand too well," she said grimly. "Now, please take a sheet of paper and write as I dictate." "To whom must I write?" he asked in surprise. "Inspector Parr," she said. "Say, 'Dear Inspector, here is the photograph which my father received the day before his death. I have not opened it, but perhaps it may interest you.'" Meekly he wrote as she ordered, and signed the letter, which, with the photograph, she put into a large envelope. "And now address it," she said, "and write on it on the top left-hand corner, 'From John Beardmore,' and put after that, 'Photograph, very urgent.'" With the envelope in her hand she walked to the door. "I shall see you to-morrow, Mr. Beardmore, if you are alive." He would have laughed, but there was something in her drawn face, some message in her quivering lips, that checked the laughter on his. End of section 15. Section 16 of The Crimson Circle by Edgar Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 38. The Arrest of Delia. It was the 7th day following the meeting of the Cabinet, and, so far from agreeing with the terms of the Crimson Circle, the Government had made it known, in the most unmistakable terms, that it refused to deal with the Circle or its emissaries. That afternoon Mr. Raphael Willings prepared for a visitor. His house in Onslow Gardens was one of the show places of the country. His collection of antique armour and swords, his priceless intaglios and his rare prints were without equal in the world. But he had no thought of his visitor's antiquarian interests when he made his preparations, and he was less deterred than stimulated by a confidential document which had come to him, intimating in plain language the character which Thalia Drummond bore. Thief she might be. Well, she could take any sword in the armoury, any print on the wall, the rarest intaglio among his show cases, so long as she was pleasant and complacent. When Thalia came, she was admitted by a foreign-looking footman, and remembered that Raphael Willings had only Italian servants in the house. Warily she surveyed the room into which she was ushered. There were open windows at each end, which surprised her. She had expected to find a little tête-à-tête tea-table. That was missing, and yet in this room was the cream of his collection, as she could see at a glance. Willings came in a few seconds later and greeted her warmly. "Eat, drink and be merry, for tomorrow we die, perhaps today," he said melodramatically. "Have you heard the news?" She shook her head. "I am the newest victim of the Crimson Circle," he said gaily enough. "You probably read the newspapers and know all about that famous company. Yes," he went on with a laugh. "Of all my colleagues I have the honour to be the first chosen for sacrifice, pour encourager les autres." She could not help wondering how, in these circumstances, Ralph Willings could preserve so unruffled a mien. "As the tragedy is due to occur in this house some time this afternoon," he was continuing, "I must ask you to extend your kindness—" There was a tap at the door, and a servant came in to say something in Italian, which the girl did not understand. Raphael nodded. My car is at the door. If you would honour me, we will have tea at my little place in the country. We shall be there in half an hour." This was a development she had not looked for. "Where is your little place in the country?" she asked. It was, he explained, between Barnet and Hatfield, and expatiated on the loveliness of Hertfordshire. "I prefer to have tea here," she said, but he shook his head. "Believe me, my dear young lady," he said earnestly, "the threat of the Crimson Circle distresses me not at all. Onslow Gardens is paradise enough with so delightful a guest. But the police have been to see me this afternoon and have changed all my plans. I told them that I had a friend coming to tea, and they suggested a more public rendezvous. The police, however, quite approve of my alternative scheme. Now, Miss Drummond, you're not going to spoil a very happy afternoon. I owe you 1,000 apologies, but I shall be very disappointed if you refuse. I have sent 2 of my servants down to have everything in readiness, and I hope to be able to show you one of the loveliest little houses within 100 miles of London." She nodded. "Very well," she said, and when he had gone, she strolled through the room, examining its fascinating contents with every appearance of interest. He came back wearing his greatcoat, and found her looking at a section of the wall which was covered with beautiful examples of the Eastern swordmaker's art. "They're lovely, aren't they? I'm so sorry I can't explain the history of them," he said, and then, in a changed tone, "Who has taken the Assyrian dagger?" There was undoubtedly a blank space in the wall where a weapon had hung, and a little label beneath the empty space was sufficient to call attention to its absence. "I was wondering the same thing," said the girl. Mr. Willings frowned. "Perhaps one of the servants have taken it down," he suggested, "though I have given them strict instructions that they are not to be cleaned except under my personal directions." He hesitated, and then, "I'll see about that when I come back," he said, and he ushered her out of the room into the waiting limousine. She could see that the loss of his precious trophy had disturbed him, for some of his animation had departed. "I can't understand it," he said as they were passing through Barnet. "I know the dagger was there yesterday because I was showing it to Sir Thomas Summers. He's keenly interested in Eastern steel work. None of the servants would dare touch the swords." "Perhaps you've had strangers in the room?" He shook his head. "Only the gentleman from police headquarters," he said, "and I'm quite sure he wouldn't have taken it. No, it's a little mystery which we can put on one side at the moment." For the rest of the journey he was attentive, polite, and mildly amusing. Not once did he give the slightest hint that he entertained any other emotion towards her than that of a well-bred man for a respected guest. He had not exaggerated the charms of his little place on the Hatfield road. In truth, it lay nearly 3 miles from the main road, and was delightfully situated in the midst of rolling and wooded country. "Here we are," he said, as he led her through a panelled hall into an exquisitely decorated little drawing room. Tea was laid, but there was no servant in sight. "And now, my dear," said Willings, "we are alone, thank heaven." His tone, his very manner had changed, and the girl knew that the critical moment was at hand. Yet her hand did not tremble as she filled the teapot from the steaming kettle, seemingly oblivious to all that he was saying. She had poured out the tea and was setting his cup in its place when, without preliminary, he stooped over her and kissed her. Another second and she was in his arms. She did not struggle, but her grave eyes were fixed steadfastly on his, and she said quietly, "I've something I'd like to say to you." "Well, you can say anything you wish, my dear," said the amorous Willings, holding her tightly and looking into her unflinching eyes. Before she could speak again, his mouth was against hers. She tried to get her arm between them and to exercise the jiu-jitsu trick she had learned at school, but he knew something of that science. She had seen on entering the room that at one end was a curtained recess, and toward this he was half lifting, half carrying her. She did not scream. Indeed, to Raphael, She seemed more yielding than he had dared to hope. Twice she tried to speak, and twice he stopped her. She struggled nearer and nearer to the curtained brocade. The two Italian servants were in the kitchen, which was somewhat removed from the room, but they heard the scream and looked at one another, and then with one accord they flew into the hall. The door of the drawing room was unlocked, they flung it open. Near by the curtain Raphael Willings lay on his face, 3 inches of Assyrian dagger in his shoulder, and standing by him, staring down at him, was a white-faced girl. One of the men jerked the dagger from his master's back and lifted him groaning to a sofa, whilst the other rushed to the telephone. In his agitation, the Italian who was endeavouring to staunch the flow of blood from the wound jabbered unintelligibly at the girl, but she did not hear him, and would not have understood him if she had. Like one in a dream, she walked slowly from the room, through the hall and into the open. Raphael Willings's car was drawn up some distance from the front of the house, and the chauffeur had left it unattended. She looked round. There was nobody in sight. Then all her energies awakened, and she sprang into the driver's seat and pressed the plug of the starter. With a whine and a splutter the engine started up, and she sent the car flying down the drive. But here was an obstacle. The iron gates at the end were closed, and she remembered that the chauffeur had had to get down to unlock them. There was no time to be lost. She backed the car, then sent it full speed at the gates. There was a smashing of glass, a crash as the gates broke, and she was in the road with a damaged radiator, lamps twisted beyond recognition, and a mudguard that hung in shreds. But the car was moving, and she set it spinning in the direction of London. The hall porter of the flats in which she lived did not recognise her, she looked so wild and changed. "Aren't you well, miss?" he asked, as he took her up in the lift. She shook her head. Once behind the door of her flat, she went straight to the telephone and gave a number, and to the man who answered she poured forth such a wild, incoherent story, a story so punctuated by sobs, that he found it difficult to discover exactly what had happened. I'm through," she gasped. "I can do no more. I will not do more. It was horrible, horrible." She hung up the receiver and staggered to her room, feeling that she was going to faint unless she took tight hold of herself. Hours passed before she was normal. And it was in that condition that Mr. Derrick Yale found her when he called that evening, her old, calm, insolent self. "This is an unexpected honour," she said coolly. "And who is your friend?" She looked at the man who was standing behind Yale. "Thalia Drummond," said Yale sternly, "I have a warrant for your arrest." "Again?" She raised her eyebrows. "I seem always to be in the hands of the police. What is the charge?" "Attempted murder," said Yale. "The attempted murder of Mr. Raphael Willings. I caution you that what you now say may be taken down and used in evidence against you." The second man stepped forward and took her arm. Thalia Drummond spent that night in the cells of Marylebone Police Station. Chapter 39. "As to what happened I have yet to learn," said Derrick Yale to a silent but attentive Inspector Parr. "I arrived at Onslow Gardens just after Willings had taken the girl away. The servants at the house were rather reluctant about giving me information, but I soon discovered that she had been taken to Willings's house in the country. Whether she enticed him or he lured her is a matter for discovery. Probably he is under the impression that she went against her will. All along I have suspected Thalia Drummond as being something more than a servant of the Crimson Circle. Naturally, I was a little alarmed and flew off to Thetfield, arriving at the house just after she had left. She escaped in Willings's car, smashing the lodge gates en route. By the way, that girl has got nerve." "How is Willings?" "He will recover. The wound is superficial. But what is significant is the proof that the crime was premeditated. Willings only missed the dagger with which he was stabbed this afternoon, after he had left the girl alone in his armoury whilst he put on his overcoat. He thinks she must have carried it in her muff, and that, of course, is very likely. He gives me no very clear account of what were the events which immediately preceded the stabbing." Said Inspector Parr. "What sort of a room was it? I mean, the room where this nearly occurred?" "A pretty little drawing room communicating with what Willings calls his Turkish room. It is a marvellous replica of an Eastern interior, and I should imagine the scene of more or less disreputable happenings. Willings hasn't the best of reputations. It is only separated from the drawing room by a curtain, and it was near the curtain that he was found." Mr. Parr was so absorbed in his meditation that his companion thought he had gone to sleep. But the inspector was not asleep. He was very wide awake. He was conscious of the appalling fact that once more whatever kudos attached to the latest of the Crimson Circle's outrages went to his companion, and yet he did not grudge him the honour. Without warning, he delivered himself of a sentiment which seemed to have no bearing whatever upon the matter they were discussing. "All great criminals come to grief through trifling errors of judgment," he said oracularly. Yale smiled. "The error of judgment in this case, I presume, being that they didn't kill our friend Willings. He's not a nice man, and I should imagine of all the members of the Cabinet he could best be spared, but I for one am very grateful that these devils did not get him." "I am not referring to Mr. Willings," said Inspector Parr, rising slowly. "I am referring to a stupid little lie told me by a man who really should have known better." And with this cryptic utterance Mr. Parr went off to break the news to Jack Beardmore. It was typical of him that Jack was the first person who came to his mind when he learned of Thalia Drummond's arrest. He was fond of the boy, fonder than Jack could guess, and he knew, even better than Yale, how heavily the weight of Thalia Drummond's guilt would lie upon the man who loved her. Jack had already received his shock. The news of the girl's arrest had been published in the stop press columns of the late editions, and when Parr arrived he was the picture of desolation. "She must have the best lawyers procurable," he said quietly. "I don't know that I ought to take you into my confidence, Mr. Parr, because you naturally will be on the other side." "Naturally," said the inspector, "but I've got a sneaking regard for Thalia Drummond too." "You?" said Jack in astonishment. "Why, I thought—" "I'm human," said the inspector. "A criminal to me is just a criminal. I have no personal grudge against the men I've arrested. Truland, the poisoner whom I sent to the gallows, was one of the nicest fellows I've ever met, and I got quite fond of him after a bit." Jack shuddered. "Don't talk of poisoners and Thalia Drummond in the same breath," he said testily. "Do you honestly believe she is the leading spirit of the Crimson Circle?" Mr. Parr pursed his thick lips. "If somebody came to me and told me the Archbishop was the leading light, I shouldn't be surprised, Mr. Beardmore," he said. "By the time this Crimson Circle business is settled, we're all going to have shocks. I started my investigations prepared to believe that anybody might be the Crimson Circle. You, or Marl, the Commissioner, or Derrick Yale, Thalia Drummond. Almost anybody." "And you still hold that opinion?" asked Jack with an attempt at a smile. "For the matter of that, Mr. Parr, you yourself might be the villain of the piece." Mr. Parr did not deny the possibility. "Mother thinks—" he began, and this time Jack did actually laugh. "Your grandmother must be a remarkable personality. Has she views on the Crimson Circle?" The inspector nodded vigorously. "She always has had, since the first murder. She put her finger down on the very spot, Mr. Beardmore, but mother always could do that sort of thing. I've had my best inspirations from her. In fact, all the—" He stopped himself. Jack was amused, but he was pitying too. This man, so ill equipped by nature for his work, had probably won himself a high place in the police service by dogged, unimaginative persistence. In every service men had reached near to the top with no other merit than their seniority. It was just a little fantastic at this moment, when the keenest brains were exercised to lay this bizarre association by the heels, to hear this stout man talking solemnly of the advice he had received from his grandmother. "I must come along and renew my acquaintance with your aunt," said Jack. "She has gone into the country," was the reply, "and I'm all alone. A woman comes in every morning to clean the place, but there's nobody there evenings. It doesn't seem like home to me now." It was a relief to Jack to get on to the subject of Mr. Parr's domestic affairs. Their very unimportance was a sedative to his racked mind. He felt that an evening spent with the inspector's knowledgeable grandparent might even restore him to something like normality. Parr himself led the conversation back to more serious channels. "Drummond will be brought up to-morrow and remanded," he said. "Is there any hope of getting bail for her?" Parr shook his head. "No, she'll have to go to Holloway, but that won't do her much harm," he said, heartlessly, as Jack thought. "It's one of the best prisons in the country, and maybe she'll be glad of the rest." "How came Yale to arrest her? I should have thought that was your job." "I instructed him," said Parr. "He has now the status of a regular police officer, and as he'd been in the case earlier in the day, I thought I would let him continue it to the end." Just as the inspector had foreshadowed, the police court proceedings of the next day were confined only to evidence of arrest, and Thalia Drummond was remanded in custody. The court house was packed, and a big crowd, attracted by the sensational character of the charge, filled all the roads approaching the court. Mr. Willings was not well enough to attend, but well enough to send his resignation to the Cabinet in response to the Prime Minister's suggestion, contained in a letter couched in such unpleasant terms, and the acidulated vocabulary of the Prime Minister was notorious, that even he, the thick-skinned Willings, was pained. Whatever happened, he was everlastingly disgraced. Even the thick and thin supporters of his policy would be revolted by the evidence he must give. He had taken the girl, a comparative stranger, to his country house, made violent love to her, and had been stabbed. There could be no romantic version of that unpleasant story, and he heartily cursed himself for his stupidity. Parr made one call upon the girl whilst she was in prison. She refused to see him in her cell, and insisted upon the interview taking place in the presence of a wardress. She explained her attitude when they sat together in the big gaunt waiting room of the gaol, he at one end of the table and she at the other. "You must excuse my not seeing you in my apartment, Mr. Parr," she said, "but so many promising young emissaries of the Crimson Circle have met with an untimely end through interviewing policemen in their cells." "The only one I can recall," said Parr stolidly, "is Sibley." "Who was a shining example of indiscretion." She showed her even white teeth in a smile. "Now, what do you want of me?" "I want you to tell me what happened when you called at Onslow Gardens." She gave him a faithful and a detailed account of that afternoon visit. "When did you discover the dagger was gone?" "When I was looking round the room whilst Willings was putting on his coat. How is Lothario?" "He's all right," said Parr. "I'm afraid he will recover. I mean," he added hastily, "I'm glad to say he'll get better. Was that the first time Willings noticed the absence of the dagger?" She nodded. "Did you carry a muff?" "Yes," she said. "Is that the place where the deadly weapon was supposed to be concealed?" "Did you have your muff in your hand when you went into his house at Hatfield?" She thought a moment. "Yes," she nodded. Inspector Parr rose. "You are getting all the food you require?" "Yes, from prison," she said emphatically. Prison food will suit me very well, thank you, and I do not want anybody, out of mistaken kindness, to send in luscious dishes from outside, as I understand prisoners on remand are allowed." He scratched his chin. "I think you're wise," he said. End of section 16. Section 17 of The Crimson Circle by Edgar Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 40. The Escape. The outrage upon Raphael Willings had produced something like a panic in the Cabinet. Mr. Parr learned how profound was the concern when he returned to headquarters, and the Prime Minister was justified in his anxiety. The Crimson Circle had not stated when the next blow would fall, or upon whom. The inspector was sent for to Downing Street and was closeted with the Prime Minister for 2 hours. It was the first personal consultation he had had, and it was followed by a meeting of the inner Cabinet, a fact that was duly recorded in the newspapers. It was said, but without authority, that the life of the Prime Minister had been threatened, and this statement was neither denied nor affirmed. Derrick Yale, returning to his flat that night, found Inspector Parr waiting on the doormat. "Is anything wrong?" he asked quickly. "I want your help," said Parr, and did not speak again until he was sitting in a comfortable chair before the fire in Yale's sitting room. "You know, Yale, that I've got to go, and the Prime Minister is considering the advisability of my going a little sooner than I had expected. There has been a Cabinet Committee appointed, and they are calling into question the methods which headquarters are employing, and I have been asked by the Commissioner to attend an informal meeting at the Prime Minister's house to-morrow evening." "What is the idea?" asked Yale. "I'm to give a sort of lecture," said Parr gloomily, "and explain to the members of the Cabinet the methods I have employed against the Crimson Circle. You probably know that I have been given unusual powers, and that I have not been asked to tell the Government all I know. I intend doing that on Friday evening, and I want your help." "My dear chap, you have it before you ask it," said Yale warmly, and Parr went on. "There is still a lot about the Crimson Circle that is a mystery to me, but I am piecing it together. At the moment I am under the impression that there is somebody at police headquarters who is working with them." "That is my view too," said Yale quickly. "Why do you say that?" "Well," said the slow Parr, "I'll give you an instance. Young Beardmore had a photograph that he found in his father's papers, and this was posted to me. It arrived all right, with the seal of the envelope intact, but when I opened it there was a blank card. I have since discovered that he gave that card to Thalia Drummond to post. He swears he stood on the doorstep and watched her slip it into the letter box on the opposite side of the road. If that is the case, the envelope must have been tampered with after it reached headquarters." "What kind of a photograph?" asked the other curiously. "It was either a picture of an execution or the condemned man Lightman, for I think it was taken on the occasion when they tried to execute Lightman and failed. It came to old man Beardmore the day before his death. A great number of things seem to have happened to the victims of the Crimson Circle the day before their death, and was found by Jack, and, as I say, sent on." "By Thalia Drummond," said Yale significantly. "My view is that you can exonerate the people at headquarters. This girl is deeper in the Crimson Circle than you imagine. I searched her house to night. That is where I've been, and this is what I've found." He went out into the hall and returned with a brown paper parcel, opened it, and the inspector stared. A gauntlet glove and a long bright bladed knife were exposed when Yale cut the string and stripped away the paper wrapping. "This glove is a fellow to that which was found in Froyant's study. The knife is an exact pair to the other." Parr took up the gauntlet and examined it. "Yes, this is the left hand, and the one on Froyant's desk was the right," he agreed. "It is a worn motor glove. Who is the owner? Try your psychometric powers, Yale." "I've already tried," said the other, shaking his head, "but the glove has passed through so many hands that the impressions I receive are very confused. At any rate, this discovery confirms the theory that Thalia Drummond is in the business up to her neck. As to the other matter you were speaking about," he said, as he wrapped the knife and glove carefully in the paper, "I shall be most happy to assist you." "What I want from you," said Parr, "is that you shall fill in the spaces which I cannot fill." He shook his head. "I only wish Mother could be there," he said regretfully. "Mother?" said the astonished Yale. "My grandmother," said Mr. Parr soberly. "The only detective in England, bar you and I." It was the first time that Derrick Yale ever had reason to suspect that Mr. Parr possessed a sense of humour. It was typical of that period of excitement, when the name of the Crimson Circle was on every tongue, that sensation should follow sensation. But probably no incident created so much excitement as that which, in scrawling headlines, greeted Derrick Yale as, sitting in bed, sipping his tea, he read the newspaper the following morning. Thalia Drummond had escaped. People escape from prison in works of fiction. They have been known to make a temporary getaway from dread Dartmoor, but never before in the history of the prison service had a woman escaped from Holloway. And yet the wardress unlocking the door of Thalia Drummond's cell in the morning found it empty. It took a great deal to shock Derrick Yale, but the news temporarily paralysed him. He read the account of the escape word by word, and in the end he was as mystified as ever. But there it was in cold print, officially admitted, and communicated to the early morning press by the Government with unnatural haste. Owing to the unusual importance of the prisoner and the character of the offence alleged against her, extraordinary precautions were taken to guard her. The patrol which usually visits the ward in which her cell was situated was doubled, and instead of hourly, half-hourly visits were paid by the officers on duty. It is not customary to look into every cell on these occasions, but at 3 o'clock this morning the wardress, Mrs. Hardy, looked through the observation hole and saw the prisoner was there. At 6 o'clock, when the cell door was opened, Drummond was missing. The bars of the window were intact, and the door had not been tampered with. A search of the prison grounds showed no trace of her footsteps, and it is almost impossible that she could have escaped over the wall. It is equally impossible that she could have left by the ordinary means, since it would have necessitated her passing through 6 separate doors, none of which had been forced, or through the gatekeeper's lodge, which is occupied throughout the night. This new proof of the Crimson Circle's omnipotence and extraordinary powers is very disconcerting, coming as it does at a moment when the lives of Cabinet Ministers are threatened by this mysterious gang. Yale glanced at the clock. It was 11:30, and then he looked at the newspaper and saw that his servant had brought him an early edition of one of the evening papers. He was out of bed in a second, and not waiting for breakfast rushed off to headquarters to find Inspector Parr, in a very good humour, considering all the circumstances. "But this is incredible, Parr. It's impossible. She must have friends in the prison." "That is my idea entirely," said Parr. "I told the Commissioner in the identical words that she must have friends in the prison. Otherwise," he said after a pause, "how did she get out?" Yale looked at him suspiciously. It did not seem the moment or the occasion for flippant talk, and Inspector Parr's tone was undoubtedly flippant. Chapter 41. Who is the Crimson Circle? Yale learned no more details than those he had already read, and took a taxi to his city office, which he had not visited for 2 days. The escape of Thalia Drummond was a much more important affair than Parr seemed to think. Parr! An awful thought occurred to Derrick Yale. John Parr. That stolid, stupid-looking man. It was impossible. He shook his head, yet put his mind resolutely to the task of piecing together every incident in which Inspector Parr had figured, and in the end, impossible. He muttered again, as he walked slowly up the stairs to his office, declining the invitation of the lift boy. The first thing he noticed when he unlocked the door was that the letter box was empty. It was a very large letter box, with a patent flap device designed so that it was impossible for an outside pilferer to extract any of its contents. The wire cage reached almost to the floor, and letters that came through the slot in the door had to fall through revolving aluminium blades, which made the letter thief's task a hopeless one. And the letter box was empty. There was not so much as a tradesman's circular. He closed the door quietly and went into his own room. He took no more than a pace into the interior and then stopped. Every drawer in his desk was open. The little steel safe by the side of the fireplace, concealed from view by the wooden panelling, had been unlocked, and the door was now open. He looked under the desk. There was a tiny cupboard, which only an expert could have found, and here Derrick Yale had kept the more intimate documents connected with the Crimson Circle case. He saw nothing but a broken panel and the mark of the chisel that had wrenched it free. He sat for a long time in his chair, staring out of the window. There was no need to ask who was the artist. He could guess that. Nevertheless, he made a few perfunctory inquiries, and the lift boy supplied him with all the information he needed. "Yes, sir. Your secretary has been this morning, the pretty young lady. She came in soon after the offices were open. She was only here about an hour, and then she left." "Did she carry a bag?" "Yes, sir, a little bag," said the boy. "Thank you," said Derrick Yale, and went back to headquarters to pour into the phlegmatic Mr. Parr's ear a tale of rifled desk and stolen documents. "Now I'm going to tell you, Parr, what I have told nobody else, not even the Commissioner," said Yale. "We think of the Crimson Circle organisation as being run by a man. I happen to know that this girl has met the man who initiated her into the mysteries of the gang, whatever they are, but I also know that, so far from being the master, this mysterious gentleman in the motor car takes his orders, as everybody else does, from the real centre of the organisation, which is Thalia Drummond." "Good Lord!" said the inspector. "You wonder why I had her in my office. I told you it was because I thought she would bring us closer to the Circle, and I was right." "But why dismiss her?" asked the other quickly. "Because she had done something which merited dismissal," said Yale, "and if I had not fired her then and there, she would have known that I was keeping her in my office with an object. I might have saved myself the trouble apparently," he smiled, "because this morning's work proves that she knew what my game was." His thin, delicate face darkened, and then he said almost sharply: "When you have told your story to night to the Prime Minister and his friends, I have a little story to tell which I think will surprise you." "Nothing you can say will ever surprise me," said Mr. Parr. The third shock which Derrick Yale received that day came on his return home. The first half of his surprise was to find that his servant was out. The one woman he employed did not sleep on the premises, but she was supposed to remain in the flat until 9 o'clock in the evening. It was exactly 6 when Derrick Yale came in to find the place in darkness. He turned on the light and made a tour of the rooms. Apparently the sitting room was the only apartment which had been disturbed, but here, whoever the intruder had been, and he could guess her name, she had been very thorough and painstaking. It was not necessary for him to seek out the servant and discover what had happened. She had been called away from the house by a message purporting to come from him, he guessed that much, and whilst she was away Thalia Drummond had examined the contents of the flat at her leisure. "A clever young woman," said Derrick without malice, for he could admire even the genius which was employed against himself. She had lost no time. Within 12 hours she had broken gaol, ransacked both his office and his flat, and had removed documents which had a vital bearing upon the Crimson Circle. He dressed himself leisurely, wondering what would be her next move. Of his own he was certain. Within 24 hours Inspector Parr would be a broken man. From a drawer in his dressing room he took a revolver, looked at it for a moment speculatively, and slipped it into his hip pocket. There was going to be a startling and a sensational end to the chase of the Crimson Circle, an end wholly unforeseen by the spectators of the tragic game. In the wide lobby of the Prime Minister's house he found a guest, the excuse for whose presence he could not fathom. Jack Beardmore had certainly been a sufferer from the activities of the Crimson Circle, but he had no part in the latter incidents. "I suppose you are surprised to see me, Mr. Yale," laughed Jack, as he took the other's hand, "but you're not more surprised than I am to be invited to a meeting of the Cabinet." He chuckled. "Who invited you? Parr?" "To be exact, the Prime Minister's secretary, but I think Parr must have had something to do with the invitation. Don't you feel scared in this company?" "Not very," smiled Derrick, slapping the other on the back. A youthful private secretary bustled in and ushered them into the severe drawing room, where a dozen gentlemen were talking in two groups. The Prime Minister came forward to meet the detective. "Inspector Parr has not arrived." He looked questioningly at Jack. "I presume this is Mr. Beardmore," he said. "The inspector particularly asked that you should be present. I suppose he has some light to throw upon poor James Beardmore's death. By the way, your father was a great friend of mine." The inspector came in at that moment. He wore a dress suit which had seen better days, a low collar with an awkwardly tied bow, and he seemed an incongruous figure in that atmosphere of intellect and refinement. Following him came the grey moustached Commissioner, who nodded curtly to his junior and led the Prime Minister aside. The two were engaged in a whispered conversation for a little time, and then the Colonel came across to where Yale was standing with Jack. "Have you any idea what sort of a lecture Parr is going to give?" he said a little impatiently. "I was quite under the impression that he was making a statement by invitation, but from what the Prime Minister tells me, it was Parr who suggested he should give the history of the Crimson Circle. I hope he isn't going to make a fool of himself." "I don't think he will, sir." It was Jack's quiet voice that had interrupted, and the Commissioner looked at him inquiringly until Yale introduced the young man. "I agree with Mr. Beardmore," said Derrick Yale. "I have not the slightest expectation of Mr. Parr making a fool of himself. In fact, I think he's going to fill up a number of gaps and bridge over seemingly irreconcilable circumstances, and I'm ready to fill in a number of spaces which he may leave blank." The company seated itself, and the Prime Minister beckoned the inspector forward. "If you don't mind, sir, I'll stay where I am," he said. "I'm not an orator, and I should like to tell this yarn as if I were telling it to any one of you." He cleared his throat and began speaking. At first his words were hesitant, and he paused again and again to find the right phrase, but as he warmed to his subject he spoke more quickly and lucidly. "The Crimson Circle," he began, "is a man named Lightman, a criminal who committed several murders in France, was condemned to death, but was saved by an accident from execution. His full name is Ferdinand Walter Lightman, and on the date of his attempted execution his age was 23 years and 4 months. He was transported to Cayenne, and escaped from that settlement after murdering a warder, and is believed got away to Australia. A man answering his description, but giving another name, was working for a storekeeper in Melbourne for 18 months, and was afterwards in the employment of a squatter named MacDonald. for 2 years and 5 months. He left Australia in a hurry, a warrant having been issued against him by the local police for attempting to blackmail his employer. What happened to him subsequently we have not been able to trace until there appeared in England an unknown and mysterious blackmailer who signed himself the Crimson Circle, and who, by careful organisation and display of remarkable patience and energy, gathered around him a large number of assistants, all of whom were unknown to one another. His modus operandi, the inspector stumbled at the phrase, was to find out somebody in a responsible position, who was either in need of money or in fear of prosecution for some offence which he or she had committed. He made the most careful inquiries before he approached his recruit, who was finally interviewed in a closed car driven by the Crimson Circle himself. Usually the rendezvous was one of the London squares, which had the advantage of having 4 or 5 exits, and a further advantage of being poorly lighted. You gentlemen are probably aware that the residential squares of London are the worst illuminated streets in the metropolis. Another class of recruit the Crimson Circle was very eager to secure was the convicted criminal. In this way he dragged in Sibley, an ex-sailor of a particularly low intelligence, who was already suspected of having committed murder, and who was the very man for the Crimson Circle's purpose. In this way he secured Delia Drummond. He paused. A thief, and an associate of thieves. In this way, too, he found the black man who murdered the railway director. For his own purpose he put in Brabazon the banker, and would have taken Felix Marl, only, unfortunately for Marl, they had been associated together in the very crime for which Lightman nearly lost his life. More unfortunate still, Marl recognised Lightman when he met him in England, and this is the reason why Marl was eventually destroyed, the murderer employing perhaps the most ingenious method that has ever been used by a homicidal criminal. You can well understand, gentlemen, he went on. They were following the little man with strained interest. The Crimson Circle. Why did he call himself Crimson Circle? It was Derrick Yale who asked the question, and for a little while the inspector was silent. He called himself Crimson Circle, he said slowly, because it was a name he had amongst his fellow convicts. About his neck was a red birthmark. And I'll blow the top of your head off if you move. The heavy caliber Webley he held in his hand covered Derrick Yale. Put your hands right up, said the inspector. And then suddenly he reached out his hand and tore away the high white collar which covered Yale's neck. There was a gasp. Red, blood red, as though it were painted by human agency, a circle of crimson ran about the throat of Derrick Yale. End of section 17. Section 18 of The Crimson Circle by Edgar Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 42. Mother. In the room 3 men had mysteriously appeared, the 3 who had captured Parr's spy 2 nights before, and in a second Yale was manacled hand and foot. A deft hand jerked the pistol that he carried from his pocket, and a 3rd man dropped a cloth bag over his head and face, and he was hurried from the room. Inspector Parr wiped the perspiration from his streaming forehead and faced his amazed audience. "Gentlemen," he said a little shakily, "if you will excuse me for tonight, I will tell you the whole of this story tomorrow." They surrounded him, plying him with questions, but he could only shake his head. "He's had a very bad time." It was the colonel's voice. "And nobody knows it better than I. I should be very glad, Prime Minister, if you could accede to the inspector's request and allow the further explanation to stand over until tomorrow." "Perhaps the inspector will lunch with us," said the Premier, and his Commissioner accepted on Parr's behalf. Gripping Jack's arm, Parr marched from the room and into the street. A taxi cab was awaiting him, and he bundled the young man in. "I feel that I've been dreaming," said Jack, when he'd found his voice. "Derrick Yale! Impossible, and yet—" "Oh, it's possible, all right," said the inspector with a little laugh. "Then he and Thalia Drummond were working together?" "Exactly," was the reply. "But, Inspector, how did you get on to this story?" "Mother put me on to it," was the unexpected answer. "You don't realise what a clever old lady Mother is. She told me to-night." "Then she's come back?" "Yes, she's come back," said the inspector. "I want you to meet her. She's a bit dogmatic, and she's inclined to argue, but I always let her have her way in that respect." "And you may be sure I shall too," laughed Jack, though he did not feel like laughing. "You really believe that the Crimson Circle is in your hands?" "I am sure of it," said the inspector. "As sure as I am sitting in this taxi cab with you, and as sure as I am that grandmother is the wisest old lady in the world." Jack maintained a silence until they were turning into the avenue. "Then this means that Thalia is dragged a little lower," he said quietly. "If this man Yale is, as you believe, the Crimson Circle, he will not spare her." "I am certain of that," said the inspector. "But, Lord bless you, Mr. Beardmore, why trouble your head about Thalia Drummond?" "Because I love her, you damned fool," said Jack savagely, and instantly apologised. "I know I'm a bit of a fool," the inspector spoke, between gusts of laughter, "but I'm not the only one in London, Mr. Beardmore, believe me. And if you'll take my advice, you'll forget that Thalia Drummond ever existed, and if you've got any love to spare, why, give it to Mother." Jack was about to say something uncomplimentary about this paragon of a grandmother, but suppressed his desire. The inspector's maisonette was on the first floor, and he went up the stairs ahead, opened the door, and stood for a moment in the doorway. "Hello, Mother," he said. "I've brought Mr. Jack Beardmore to see you." Jack heard an exclamation. "Come in, Mr. Beardmore. Come in and meet Mother." Jack stepped into the room and stood as if he'd been shot. Facing him was a smiling girl, a little pale and a little tired looking, but undoubtedly, unless he were mad or dreaming, Thalia Drummond. She took his outstretched hand in hers and led him to the table, where a meal for three was laid. "Daddy, you told me you were going to bring the Commissioner," she said reproachfully. "Daddy?" stammered Jack. "But you told me she was your grandmother." She patted his hand. "Daddy has developed a sense of humour, which is very distressing," she said. "I'm always called Mother at home, because I've mothered him ever since my own dear mother died, and that story about his grandmother is nonsense, but you must forgive him." "Your father?" said Jack. Thalia nodded. "Thalia Drummond Parr, that is my name. Thank goodness you aren't a crime investigator, or you would have made inquiries and discovered my ghastly secret. Now, eat your supper, Mr. Beardmore, I cooked it myself." But Jack could neither eat nor drink until he had learned more, and she proceeded to enlighten him. "When the first of the Crimson Circle murders occurred, and Daddy was put into the case, I knew that he had a tremendous work in front of him, and that the chances were he would fail. Daddy has a lot of enemies at headquarters, and our Commissioner asked him not to take the case, knowing how difficult it was going to be. You see, the Commissioner is my godfather," she added smilingly, "and naturally he takes an interest in our affairs. But Daddy insisted, though I think he regretted it the moment he had taken it on. I've always been interested in police work, and just as soon as father got behind the Crimson Circle organization and knew the methods that the Circle employed to gather its recruits, I decided to start upon a career of crime. Your father received the first threat 3 months before it was put into execution. It was 2 or 3 days afterwards that I secured a post as secretary to Harvey Froyant, for no other reason than that his estate adjoined yours. He was a friend of your father, and it gave me an opportunity of watching. I tried to get employment with your father. Perhaps you don't know that," she said quietly, "but I failed. Even more dreadful, I was in the wood when he was killed." She squeezed his hand sympathetically. "I didn't see who it was who fired the shot, but I flew forward to where your father was lying, only to discover that he was beyond help, and then, seeing you through the trees running across the meadows towards the wood, I thought I had better get away. The more so," she added, "since I had a revolver in my hand at the time, for I had seen a man stalking in the wood, and had gone in to investigate. With the death of your father there was no longer any need for me to remain in the service of Mr. Froyant. I wanted to get closer to the Crimson Circle, and I knew the best way to attract the attention of the man who controlled the gang was for me to embark on a criminal career. It was not providential that you were passing the pawn shop when I came out after pledging Mr. Froyant's golden image. My father manoeuvred that, and when he described me as a thief and an associate of crooks, it was to create an atmosphere which would impress Derrick Yale, or Ferdinand Walter Lightman, to give him his real name. There was no danger of my being sent to prison. The magistrate treated me as a first offender, but my reputation was gone, and immediately after, as I expected, I received a summons to meet the head of the Crimson Circle. I met him one night in Stane Square. I think Daddy was watching me all the time and shadowed me back to the house. He was never far away, were you, darling?" "Only at Barnet." He shook his head. "I was scared there, mother." "My first task as a member of the Crimson Circle was to go to Brabazon. You see, Yale's method was to set one member to spy upon another. Mr. Brabazon puzzled me. I was never quite sure whether he was straight or crooked, and of course I had no idea at first that he was a member of the gang. I had to begin stealing again in order to sustain my character. It brought down on me a reprimand from my mysterious chief, but it served a useful purpose, for it brought me into contact with a gang of crooks, and led unconsciously to my being present in Marisburg Place when Felix Marl also died. Yale's object in employing me was to divert suspicion from himself. Besides which, he had intended a very pretty ending to my youthful life. The night he killed Froyant I was ordered to be in the vicinity of the house with a similar knife and the fellow gauntlet to that which Yale used himself in his dreadful crime." "But how did you escape from prison?" asked Jack. She looked at him with amusement in her eyes. "You dear boy," she said. "How could I escape from prison? I was let out by the governor in the middle of the night, and escorted to my home by a respectable inspector of police." "We wanted to force Yale's hand, you see," explained Parr. "As soon as he knew that mother was out, he got rattled and began to hurry his preparations for flight. When he found that his office had been burgled, he was pretty sure that Delia was something more than he had dreamt she was." Chapter 43. The Story Continued. Jack went to the luncheon party the next day, and so too did Delia, who had played such a part, and was the public heroine of the hour. After lunch the inspector completed his story. "If you take your minds back, gentlemen, you will remember that the name of Derrick Yale had never been heard until the first of the Crimson Circle murders. It is true that he had established himself in a city office, that he had issued circulars, had put advertisements in the paper describing himself as a psychometric detective, but the cases which came to him were very few. Of course, he did not want any cases. He was working up to his big coup. It was after the first murder, you remember, that Derrick Yale was employed by a newspaper, which wanted a good sensational story, to employ his psychometric powers in the tracking of the criminal. Who knew better than Yale the name of the murderer and how the murder was committed? You remember that he was able to reconstruct the crime by feeling the weapon with which it was committed, and, in consequence, a black man was arrested in exactly the spot where Derrick Yale said he would be. Naturally, when these facts were disclosed, Yale's reputation rose sky high. It was the very situation that he expected. He knew now that a man threatened by the Crimson Circle would be inclined to call in his assistance, and that is just what happened. By being near his victims and gaining their confidence, for Yale was a most convincing type of man, he was able to urge them to pay the demands of the Crimson Circle, and if they refused, he was on hand to encompass their death. Froyant might not have died, and certainly would not have died at Yale's hands, but for the fact that, annoyed by losing so much money, he made enquiries himself. Starting on a hypothesis which was based upon the faintest suspicion, he worked up the case against Derrick Yale, and was able to identify Lightman and Derrick Yale as one and the same person. On the night of his death he sent for us, intending to make this disclosure, and as a proof that he was in some fear, he had 2 loaded revolvers by his hand, and it is well known that Froyant disliked intensely the employment of firearms. And you will remember, if you have read the official minutes of the case, the Commissioner rang up Froyant in response to a call which Harvey Froyant had put through. That call gave Yale his opportunity. It was an excuse for Froyant sending us out of the room. I went first, never dreaming that he would dare do what he did. When we went into the room we wore our overcoats, and I particularly noticed that Derrick Yale kept his hand in his pocket. On the hand, gentlemen, he said impressively, was a motor driver's gauntlet, and in that hand was the knife that slew Froyant. "But why did he wear the glove?" asked the Prime Minister. "In order that his hand, which I should see immediately afterwards, should not be blood-stained. The moment my back was turned he lunged straight at Froyant's heart, and Froyant must have died instantly. He slipped off the glove and left it on the table, walked to the door, and seemed to be carrying on a conversation with a man who was already dead. I knew this had happened, but I had no proof. He had brought my daughter there, intending to get her into the house, which we immediately searched, with the intention of accusing her of the crime. But she very wisely went no farther than to the back of the house, and then, suspecting his plot, went home. But I am anticipating. Amongst the people whom we had to guard was James Beardmore, and James Beardmore was a land speculator, a man who knew all kinds of people, good and bad. That day he was expecting a visit from Marl, whom he had never seen, and he mentioned Marl's name earlier in the day to his son, but not to Derrick Yale. As Marl came toward the house, the last person in the world he expected to see was his fellow criminal of Toulouse gaol, a man whom he had betrayed to his death. Derrick Yale must have been standing at the end of the shrubbery, and Marl caught a momentary glimpse of him and went back to the village, ostensibly to London, in a panic of fright, determined in his fear that he would kill Lightman before Lightman killed him. His courage must have oozed. He was not a particularly brave man, and instead he wrote a letter to Yale, pushing it under his window, a letter which Yale read and partially burned. What the letter was I cannot tell you, except it was probably a statement that if he, Marl, was left alone, he would leave Yale alone. He could not have known in what capacity Mr. Derrick Yale was posing. The words Block B undoubtedly referred to the block at Toulouse prison. From that moment Marl was a doomed man. He was conducting a little blackmail of his own with Brabazon, an agent of the Crimson Circle, and Brabazon must have intimated the danger to Yale, who, in his capacity as detective, visited the shop to which all the Crimson Circle letters were addressed, and on the pretext of aiding justice, opened them of course, and saw their contents without having the responsibility of being the person to whom they were addressed. It was Brabazon's intention to bolt on the day of Marl's murder, and with that object he had cleared out the whole of Marl's balance and had made preparations for flight. On Marl's death, suspicion naturally fell upon him, and, intimated by the Crimson Circle that he was in danger, he hurried off to the riverside house which we searched. Detective Inspector Parr chuckled. When I say we searched it, I mean Yale searched it. In other words, he went into the room where he knew Brabazon was and came down reporting that all was clear. There's one point I'd like you to clear up. The chloroforming of Yale in his office, said the Prime Minister. That was clever, and deceived me for a moment. Yale handcuffed, strapped and chloroformed himself after he had put the money in an envelope and dropped it down the letter chute. It was addressed to his private residence. Do you remember, sir, that the postman left the building, having cleared the box, a few minutes after the outrage? Unfortunately for Yale, I had let Delia into the room and put her into the cupboard, where she witnessed the whole comedy, and retrieved the chloroform bottle which he had put into a drawer of his desk. The last victim, Mr. Raphael Willings, here Parr spoke very clearly and deliberately, owes his life to the fact that he conceived an unhealthy attachment for my daughter. She was struggling with him when, looking over her shoulder, she saw a hand come from behind the curtain holding the very knife that had been stolen earlier in the day by Yale, again in his capacity as detective. It was aimed at Mr. Willings's heart, but by a superhuman effort she thrust him aside, but not so far as to save him completely. Yale, of course, was on hand to discover the outrage. I should imagine he was very annoyed when he found it was not a murder, and of course he had no difficulty in fixing it upon mother, upon Thalia Drummond Parr. Consider the cleverness of his operations, said Parr admiringly. He had thrust himself into the front rank of private detectives, so that he was on hand to receive information which was invaluable to him as the Crimson Circle. He was eventually taken to police headquarters, at my suggestion, where the most important documents came under his notice. Some of them were not quite as important as he thought, but it saved Mr. Beardmore's life when Yale had the first handling of a photograph of himself taken a few moments before the abortive execution. Now, gentlemen, are there any other points that you wish cleared up? There is one I will clear up which is probably not obscure. 2 days ago I told Yale that great criminals are usually brought to their end through ridiculous mistakes. Yale had the effrontery to tell me that he had called at Mr. Willings's house after he had left, and that the servants had told him where Thalia and Willings had gone. That alone was sufficient to damn him, because he had not been near Willings's house since the morning, and had arrived at the country place at least an hour before the servants had come. The question that disturbed me for the moment, said the Prime Minister, is what reward we can give to your daughter, Mr. Parr. Your promotion is of course an easy matter to arrange, for there is an assistant commissionership vacant at this moment, but I don't exactly see what we can do for Miss Drummond, except of course to give her the monetary reward which is due for having brought about the capture of this dangerous criminal. Then a husky voice spoke. It sounded to Jack as though it were his, and the rest of the people about the table seemed to be under the same impression. "There is no need to bother about Miss Parr," said this strange voice, that was speaking Jack's thoughts. "We're getting married very soon." When the buzz of congratulation had subsided, Inspector Parr leant toward his daughter. "You didn't tell me, mother," he said reproachfully. "I didn't even tell him," she said, looking at Jack wonderingly. "Do you mean to say he hasn't asked you to marry him?" demanded her amazed father. She shook her head. "No," she said, "and I haven't told him I would marry him either, but I had a feeling that something like this would happen." Lightman, or Yale, as he was best known, was an exemplary prisoner. His only complaint against the authorities was that they would not let him smoke on his way to his execution. "They order these things much better in France," he said to the governor. "Now, the last time I was executed—" To the chaplain he expressed the warmest interest in Thalia Drummond. "There's a girl in a million," he said. "I suppose she will marry young Beardmore. He is a very lucky fellow. Personally, women arouse very little enthusiasm in me, and I ascribe my success in life to this fact. But if I were a marrying man, I think Thalia Drummond would be the very type I should search for." He liked the chaplain, because the padre was a big human man who could talk interestingly on places and things and people, and Derrick Yale had seen most of the fascinating places in the world. On a grey March morning a man came into his cell and strapped his hands. Yale looked at him over his shoulder. "Have you ever heard of Monsieur Pallion? He was a member of your profession." The executioner did not reply, being by etiquette forbidden to discuss other matters than the prisoner's forgiveness for the deed which was about to be committed. "You should find out something about Pallion," said Yale, as the procession formed, "and profit by his example. Never drink. Drink was my ruin. If it were not for drink, I should not be here." This little conceit kept him amused all the way to the scaffold. They slipped the noose about his neck and covered his face with a white cloth, and then the executioner stepped back to the steel lever. "I hope this rope won't break," said Derrick Yale. It was the last message from the Crimson Circle. The end. End of The Crimson Circle by Edgar Wallace. Recorded for LibriVox.org by Anna Simon in the year 2017 in Nijmegen, the Netherlands.